Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever the case may be. For all of you listening out there across the crazy planet Earth, welcome to Vestiges After Dark. And I am your host, Bishop Brian Willett, coming to you live from the deep woods of Western Georgia on this November 15th, 2022. Tonight we've got a great show for you. We have a brand new guest, but not someone that's unfamiliar to all of you. We have Father Firth with us to talk about sacred spaces and relationships. And he's going to be our guest. So you know him from the chat room. He's in there almost every week. He contributes. He's called into the show several times. Fantastic person to discuss theology. And we have a fun 3 hours for you coming up. Don't go away. Everyone, I hope you are all having a fantastic evening tonight. We have a great show coming up here, but before we get started, we have to do liturgical libations with Jamie Wolf, who's right here with me. How are you doing tonight, Jamie?
Hi, everybody. So this evening, I got a 15-year. I know, right? This is a Glendalough. It's a Irish whiskey, 13 years. 13 years in American oak, finished in Mizunara oak, Japanese whiskey barrels. Yep. And it's supposed to have notes of apricots.
I taste the apricot for sure.
Apricots, vanilla, coconut, spices. Yeah.
So I have a rule.
We had to put some water in it.
Yeah, I have a rule. Any whiskey, unless you're talking about a bourbon, okay, an American whiskey, or a if you're doing a Canadian whiskey, for example, their preparations and are different than what you see in Ireland and Scotland. Okay, so I have a rule when I buy Irish or Scottish whiskey for my collection. I tend to not go younger than 15 years because I find it's exceptionally hot. Now, there's certain uses for younger whiskeys.
They got a 12-year that's very good.
Well,
this one's a little hot to me.
I mean, that's true. That's true. And I mean, there are some uses for younger whiskeys, like Islay. My favorite. Mm-hmm. If you're really trying to get a huge peat bomb with tons of smoke, the younger, the stronger that is going to be. But also the hotter and more alcoholic it tends to be. So you definitely want to put some water in it. We put some water in this. The flavors are wonderful, but it is very hot, very alcoholic. I think, given another 3 years, it would have been perfect.
I poured us about a dram and a half, and I refuse to quit, so I might get a little rosy cheeked by hour 2.
Well, I mean, like I said, it has its uses. Just add water, and you'll be fine. I mean, that's kind of what you do with this stuff. Okay, so let's get started here, all right, with, I guess I have to do comments and questions from the ether. And this day we have a brand new one from Facebook. This came in from Audrey. And the question is, I have a question. Is it possible for a person that is possessed to be able to coexist with the entity for many years without many problems? As in problems, I mean some blackouts when stressed or upset, speaking in different accents, sleepwalking. Those are the main things that happen from time to time. The reason I ask is because many psychics say they feel strange around me and it scares them. Plus, every time doctors say I'm going to die, I amazingly am healed and doing better without meds. There's no explanation for any of it other than possession, and they don't want me to die. Okay, so there's a few things to unpack here with this one. Okay, let's start with the primary question. All right, and that is it possible for a person that is possessed to be able to coexist with the entity for many years without many problems?
Absolutely.
Yes, it is possible. It is possible. I wouldn't say, though, it is something that would happen without many problems. There's going to be problems there. Whether you're aware of them or not is another factor, but there is certainly going to be problems. So can you have a possession? Again, we wouldn't call that possession. Okay. So we have to make sure that we're defining the terms here correctly and we're using the right semantics. Okay. So that's why we have different stages of identification. Okay, so typically there's three primary ones that we use, and that is, the main one is obviously possession. And then a lesser version of this with different characteristics is oppression, and then there's finally obsession. Okay, these are different stages of the demonic attachment process. So a person who is possessed, who has reached that state of integration with a demonic entity, is not going to be able to coexist for many years without problems. Can they coexist without the victim knowing about it? Possibly. There is such a thing as perfect possession, in which case there could be everyone in the person's life is not aware that there's a possession that has taken place there. That is something that can absolutely occur. Some people might say it's more common than we even think. But the fact is, possession is not without problems. There's always going to be problems, no matter what.
Occasional blackout.
Yes. Occasional blackout.
Major.
Yeah. That sounds more
Don't know
like
where I've been for the last 4 hours.
Yeah. That blackouts, when stressed and upset, speaking in different accents, sleepwalking. Well, sleepwalking is not really a thing that we would look at it. I mean, there's a lot of things that can cause that. But the fact is, those things sound more like oppression to me, or prepossession before the integration point. Psychics say they feel strange around me. Well, psychics feel strange around almost everybody, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And then the whole thing about doctors saying you're going to die and then being healed and doing better without meds. I mean, there could be something to that one. If prayer makes you better and medication does not, that could be something that we'd want to look at. But I disagree with where there's no explanation other than possession. There's a lot of explanations there, possession being the least of
we don't know the medical conditions or
exactly.
anything.
So the point and the moral of the story here is to not jump the gun. Okay, don't jump the gun on what your assessment is. Don't diagnose yourself. Okay, people think because you're dealing with spiritual matters that somehow you don't need to really consult with the professionals. You can just basically self-diagnose, and then you'll only seek a professional's help if you want to deal with it or have help resolving it. But the diagnostic aspect is the most important part of the exorcist. You're really wasting both your time and the exorcist's time if you're going in already under the assumption that you're possessed. I can guarantee you, if you are possessed, you're not going to be writing to me on a Facebook message and saying, hey, can possession coexist with this? A possessed person's not going to do that. Okay? An oppressed person might. A possessed person will not. A possessed person does not want to see me. A possessed person would not want to interact with me whatsoever. And so don't worry, you're not possessed. Okay. Oppression is a possibility, although I would be very cautious with that. And there's no way to really know without doing a full assessment. But just because psychics feel strange around you, I mean, most psychics are full of shit. So I would not worry about what psychics tell you. Okay. There are a few good ones, very few though. All right. And most of them are in it for some kind of personal motivation. So you got to look out for that. Don't worry about what they say. really what you're looking at here, and the issues here that are of concern are the blackouts and speaking in different accents. That is something that, we would want to take a deeper look at. But oppressed people can do that, even obsessed people can do that. Does not guarantee possession. And there are people that can live for many years with obsession and oppression and never reach the point of possession. Possession is quite rare and not something that we see very often. So I hope that answers the question. And like I said, if you're really seeking the help of an exorcist, you don't go into it with already the assumption that you are possessed, because you wouldn't be even asking for help if you were. Okay?
It's the old adage, when we have a client come to us that says they're possessed, we know they're not.
Oh, almost every time. Really, I mean, oppression is typically, it looks so much like it. Severe oppression can look just like possession, can have all the characteristics of possession, but it's not possession. Once you've reached the point of possession, there's very little personal will left, almost none. And there might be just bouts of lucidity, but rarely. You would not be able to function whatsoever. You wouldn't need a psychic to tell you that they feel strange about you. Everybody in your life would say you need to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
Honestly, yeah, something wrong with you. Yeah, that's not going to be something that possession would reflect. So I hope that rests your mind in some ways. But yeah, you might have something going on. You might want to get that. You might want to talk to a priest about that in your local area and see if they can help you to get yourself back on track. Okay, we wish you the best and we pray for you. Okay, we got a great show tonight. I'm really kind of excited about this one because this has been a cursed season. I have to say,
sure has.
It really has. I mean, between all the technical issues, which we thankfully seem to have resolved. Definitely, my assessment was correct that it clearly seemed to have been the simulcasting does not work with the speed of this internet here. This internet's too weak for simulcasting. Mm-hmm. So at least we're able to bring to you a direct feed. It does get a little choppy from time to time, but not anything that seems to be cutting us out, which thankfully we've been able to do the last 2 episodes without too much trouble. So I think we're just going to continue with that until something changes in our internet where we can maybe upgrade. We're just not there right now with our service. They just don't have anything better than this without paying thousands of dollars. So, we're just going to keep going with what we're doing right now for the time being. I hope that it works for all of you. It's certainly working at least adequately for us. And this is a podcast. Most of our audience listens only to the podcast, the audio only version. Very few of you actually tune into this YouTube video version. Very few do. It really, as long as we're able to get the podcast out there, that's what matters. So it's been a cursed season. This is going to be the second to the last episode for this season. Next week will be the season finale. I wanted to do 10. I usually like to do 10 for the fall season, but it just wasn't going to work out this year. So next week we will actually be doing open lines, open topics. That'll be our season finale. Hopefully we can go out with a bang and then come back for season 7 in the winter and maybe, have a whole new fresh start,
settled.
Because I think there has not been one episode this season that did not have issues. And if I seem a little frazzled or distracted sometimes, it's because I'm seeing all these lights flashing on my screen being like, this is going wrong and this is failing and then I'm trying to host the show while I'm trying to solve these problems. I'm not a great multitasker. I don't think really there's such a thing as being a good multitasker. There's just people that can fake it, and then there's people that can't fake it. No one's really a good multitasker, even pilots. And I am a pilot, and I think that kind of helps me to do all of this stuff. But even then, the brain is not designed to multitask. We've made that up out of, just pure, it's pure bullshit, honestly. Okay, let's get started with tonight's show because I'm really excited about this. So tonight we have Father Walter Firth, okay? And he's coming to the show to discuss creating sacred spaces in our homes and in our relationships and how this can help us both in our daily lives and in preparing for a good death, which is something you hear me talk about all the time on the show.
Yes, sir.
Dying well is an important part of spirituality. Not something we ever really talk about. Even in the church, you hardly hear anybody talking about dying well. Most Christians in the United States of America think that Jesus took care of it or will take care of it. It's a big major presumption, and they're not understanding their role that they play in it. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But Father Walter is an Australian Anglican priest with a background as a high school teacher. His interests lie in the nurturing of sacred lives in children, on which subject he was recently awarded a Ph.D. from the University of South Africa. A regular contributor to our chat page and an occasional caller, we look forward to getting to know Father Walter a whole lot better. Welcome, Father, to the show.
Thank you.
It's great having you here in video this time. This is wonderful.
Yes, we finally get to put a face behind the voice.
Yes,
there.
finally.
I do like the anonymity of only being a disembodied voice without a visual representation. I can be whoever you'd like. In your mind.
That's true. That's true. Well, I mean, I hate to take away a little of the mystery tonight, but you know what? We got many seasons to come, and there's always new people to watch. So you never know who's going to be out there in the chat room. You'll be a mystery to them, I guarantee you. We also have Father Chris with us tonight. How you doing, Father?
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm well. I must do a mea culpa first, which is to say that I wrongly put that Father Walter got his PhD from the University of South Africa. It was the University of Pretoria, which is in South Africa.
Pretoria,
right.
Okay.
Political capital of South Africa, but there's an understandable confusion. One of his supervisors is on the faculty of the University of South Africa as well.
I see. Okay. Well, I'll try. If you try to help me remember, I can go back in there and edit in the description for the show for the archive.
Cool. But that is my fault.
An L added to my name too.
There you go.
Where you'd like to get to know Father Water better.
Nice. But yeah, and actually, I wanted to just say something about the question from the ether about possessed persons. I saw somebody yesterday. I was walking through the city centre, and he was definitely possessed. And I don't often say that, you know as well as I do how reticent we are to say things like that.
Of course, yeah.
But what was really, when you said about, possessed people don't reach out, don't want to have any contact with you, this guy pretty much shouted it. There were several people in the street, it was right in the city centre, and he shouted at everybody, and there was a group of blokes, and some were sort of standing around as he walked off to check he didn't, assault anybody or anything like that. He was carrying a bag. He was obviously homeless. And so he shouted at absolutely everybody, and I thought, at sod's law, he's going to be going the way I'm going, because I was going to visit a parishioner. Yeah. And he was, and I got to the apartment frontage door, and there he was stood by it, and I thought, he's going to shout at me now. But you know what?
He gave you the wide berth, didn't he?
He said absolutely nothing. That's right. Now, I wasn't dressed like this. I was actually, for once, in civvies. So, I didn't look like a priest, but I was carrying the Blessed Sacrament and a stole, because I was taking it to a parishioner who's housebound. And, didn't say a word. So
see, I don't find that for people that are really under a severe...
That's actually happened to me, too. I'm not a priest.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find that people that are under severe oppression or possession, you don't have to look at... They know. They just have an instinct for... they can feel it from you, and they want to either avoid you, or I've people have gotten aggressive with me. I think I've talked about on this show before, where I was at a mall once, and of course I'm always dressed in casual attire unless I'm working. So it's not often that, you're going to see me in clerical blacks, but I was at a mall with my wife and son. They had gone into a store, and I was just waiting. I went over to the Godiva. We still had Godiva back then. They took all our stores out of the United States, but back then we still had Godiva stores. And I went in to get some truffles, and I was just kind of munching down on some truffles, waiting for them to come out, when I caught the eye contact with a woman that was, I'd say, at least 30 or 40 feet away from me, way down at the other end of this open atrium. And it just caught eyes with her for maybe a second or two. And then, because she just was I don't know, I could just tell that she was sort of looking my way, and you kind of get that feeling when someone's looking at you.
Oh yeah.
And so I noticed, and I saw her, and we made eye contact, and then, it lasted for maybe 1 or 2 seconds, and then I looked down and grabbed another piece of chocolate. The next thing I knew is I saw in the peripheral vision movement. So I looked up again, and here she is charging me, like running at me like a lunatic. And she runs right up to me, and she gets right in my face and says, "I don't like you." And then turns around and just walks back to her husband and kid, starts laughing and, carrying on like nothing happened. And see, that's a perfect, I think, example of potential perfect possession, because here she is functioning well within, and then all of a sudden this happens.
Your presence triggered her.
Her
little demon.
Yeah, and I wasn't dressed like a priest. I didn't have the Blessed Sacrament. I didn't even have a blessed object.
Probably your aura shining in the...
Well, I think partly you only have to be baptized,
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah, baptized.
In your faith.
Holy orders probably didn't hurt, but
No. Yeah.
But they can sense it. They can sense it for sure. Well, Father Firth, we're so happy to have you with us, and I really can't wait to unpack some of what you have for us tonight. So, I guess sacred spaces. One of the things that I've noticed in the world today is that people have lost their connection to these types of things. And, in the ancient world, it was very well established. Almost every major religion has these places in the world that are these larger than life environments, sacred places that have been sacred for thousands of years, the Temple Mount being the sacred space for the Jewish people. You have Mecca, the sacred place, for Muslim. Of course, they have Medina. They also have the Temple Mount too. Disputing, who actually has the authority over that plot of land. It's things like this, and people fight over. They die over these sacred spaces. So clearly, they're important. We even see it in Asia. There's these places that are of great significance. The Bodhi tree for the Buddhists. There's a place where you can go and see where the Buddha attained enlightenment. I guess that what makes Christianity somewhat unique, and though we have our sacred spaces too, we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where not only the crucifixion but the resurrection is represented there. There's some historical validation that would suggest that likely, that was the spot, or at least very close to it. So you have the tomb there very nearby. And we have, of course, the Vatican built on the very tomb of St. Peter, the crucifixion site, all that stuff. So we're not strangers to it as Christians. But what makes, I think, our religion unique in the sense that we now, because all of these other religions in the world are working towards trying to reach up to God. They're trying to find places where they can go to get closer to God. Whereas as Christians, we get the benefit of God finding us. He comes to us where we're at. And so a Christian church can be anywhere. A place of prayer can be anywhere. And I think what makes this show important tonight is that people have lost their ability to realize how much power they have in creating a sacred space right there in their own home.
Right.
I think even pagans today do a better job with this than Christians do.
They have their altars.
They do. They have their altars and whatnot. So I think it's a good thing. It's a good lesson for Christians to understand that, you can have these larger than life places, and they're important and they're wonderful. And certainly nothing's more wonderful than walking into a gigantic Gothic cathedral with the, or the stained glass, and, you feel like you're in an otherworldly kind of place. There's certainly an aura to it that is beyond anything that you can experience at home. However, that being said, the whole idea of where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst, is very powerful for the Christian. And that can be anywhere. That can be literally in your car. That could be, and I mean, you don't even need the 2 or 3. I mean, we can connect to God directly. Contemplation, meditation can happen anywhere. The rosary can be taken with us, and we can turn that moment into a sacred space. Space right. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a location. It can sometimes be a moment in time. So that's, I think, where I want to kind of begin there is How do you see sacred spaces? Clearly, you see the importance in it. What would you like to use as the launching point for getting the audience into this tonight?
Well, I think you raised an interesting point when you talked about pre-established sacred space throughout history.
Yeah.
The big problem with that is you started big, and sacred space never starts big. It begins small. Mm-hmm. It is either individual or, more often than not, family related. So a family creates a sacred space. An individual has a moment. That moment is important to them. It could be a dream. It could be an epiphany. It could be a moment of realization. And they take that and they project it either further, or they mark the location that occurred in, and they come back to that spot for reconnection. And over time, and when you've got thousands of years, you can build up amazing things at a location. Mm-hmm. Then you get the Temple Mount. Then you get Mount Sinai. Places like Mecca. Mecca was a sacred site to other religions long before Islam came along.
Right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And what you see is the importation of new sacred meaning over top of another sacred site. Christianity's done it too. There's some beautiful churches in Spain where they used to be a mosque.
Right.
We turned it back into a church.
And we converted pagan temples and
Yep.
So we've done it. Yeah.
So I'm just being careful. I don't want to assume or have people presume that I have one religion as perfect and everyone else is not.
Right.
Because we all do it. It's the way human beings transmit their own sacredness somewhere else. And it's also why, if we don't set out a space for that, we struggle to pop it out anywhere else. You could do it on a bus, but when you're trying to pray on a busy bus, the moment may be sacred to you because you find a sense of calm in the rote prayer, the words. The space itself isn't sacred. You have retreated within. Mm-hmm. You haven't projected out. An object you might have could enable the creation of sacred space. It may be pulling out prayer beads. It could be pulling out a menorah and beginning to light the candles. Like the moment these items start to engage and act with the physical world, then they pop up the sacred space and we engage in that. And then when we put the item away, the space folds back into the item. But I think we've had a very, very big Western error in the way we act, because we say, oh, the church, isn't that building beautiful? Oh, look at the temple. Look how it shines when the sun hits the gold plates on the mount. Mm-hmm. Look at the jewels embedded in the walls. Look at our Gothic architecture or neo-Gothic architecture. Isn't it marvelous? Actually, if that isn't the way you connect or search for God, you may not feel the sacredness of that space necessarily. Or if the space has been deconsecrated by other acts over time. And we experienced this when we traveled through Russia. Some of the old churches were protected, the icons protected, preserved by people who very quickly used them to store food or other parcels so that the building wasn't destroyed. Minimal damage, but the sacredness in the spot it's not absolutely gone. If you were to really push me, I would say it is sleeping. Mm-hmm. One day it may reawaken. For somebody else, that sacred spot may have been where they were thinking about God and God spoke to them And that could be under a tree. And of course, if you look at a lot of religious beliefs throughout the world, including in early Judaism, God spoke to people through trees.
Yeah.
So when people sat under the trees, and they're not just sitting under the tree for a break in the shade, it's intentional. They go to that space to sit and think. And then God talks to them in that moment. Or a spiritual being talked to them in that moment. That space then becomes more sacred. They mark that space off so that the exterior world isn't having an adverse effect on the location. The place becomes special. Over time, the tree might die, but a pile of rocks is put in its place. The rocks grow. One day we get a building, and it becomes a monument. All time passes, the people who it was sacred to move on, and you get nothing but a tree stump, because the people and people have taken that sacredness off with them.
Yeah, because I was thinking, like, a couple thoughts came to mind while you were talking. The first one being Saint Teresa of Avila's interior castle. The idea of this. I mean, much of her contemplation was understanding this internal sacredness, this internal sacred space that she could retreat to anywhere at any time. That she certainly understood that she carried with her. That this was this connection point directly with God that was right there. And certainly didn't need a church or a monastery or convent for that. It was, there, it was present, it was alive, and something that she could connect to at multiple points throughout her life. And then you have places like Stonehenge, perhaps, where certainly, the sacredness of that has moved on, largely because, I guess it's potentially a Druidic site. There aren't really any actual Druids today. There's people that claim to be Reconstructionist Druids, but we don't really have any lineage that goes back to the original Druids, and much of the rituals that they would have practiced or belief systems have been lost to time. So, clearly very sacred location at some point, and has not been used again, except in, I guess, neo-paganism, where they find something to it. But I know that there are people that have gone to Stonehenge. I have not been, but my wife has been, and even my wife back then, who was quite secular, had not been baptized yet. It was before she knew me, or before we were married, at least. And she would have, her going there, she could feel that there was definitely power there. That it was a place of power that was just present in that location, that still sort of resides there. So you mentioned about this, that it's sleeping, that almost as if, this energy lies dormant for however long it takes, and then it can be reawakened at some point. Do you think then, and this is an interesting question for you, do you think that the reason that people feel Stonehenge, feel power there, even though it hasn't been an active spiritual location in recent memory, that the neo-pagan interest has resurrected or reawakened that power? Do you think that's what it is?
I think it will have begun to refeed it, and it shifts from being lost to under the surface to sleeping. And then if it becomes a lived site again, then there'll be the transference of energy in and out of space. Because that sacredness and the energy of sacredness is active then, and people putting out and pulling in, putting out, pulling in. One of the big catches with that, of course, is that we also know that Stonehenge was absolutely ignored for a large chunk of time. People didn't feel anything.
Really? Yeah.
I was going to say, when I was a kid, because the road goes straight past Stonehenge, and when you can't now, but when I was a kid, you could literally pull in on the side of the road, You could drive up to Stonehenge.
Could you actually walk to the
touch the
stones?
stones,
Could you
yeah.
touch them back then?
Yeah,
You could.
absolutely.
So they weren't protected
Yeah.
like they are now.
No. So it's not.
And you felt
not
nothing.
long ago.
You felt nothing when you were there, or did you?
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, look, I think that all of these places where people have gathered for worship of whatever form
Carries energy.
leaves an imprint.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of it sleeping is quite a good image. If you think of, the sorts of, I mean, this is a bit Hollywood, but you think of the horror films where, there's a haunted house and everything's fine until a family with a child of a certain age moves in, and then all of a sudden this thing reawakens.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, that's a ham version, but it's that kind of, because I also think Church of England churches are very old. Some of them are Saxon. And it's very hard to separate my own psychology from this, but and so I just declare that as something I find impossible. But you go into these ancient churches. Like I was confirmed, for example, in a leper chapel. So the chapel goes back to, I think, the 12th century, something like that.
Wow.
And that post-Reformation, the Holy Mass was not celebrated there for a very long time. And then as an Anglo-Catholic, you go back and you do that. All of a sudden, the place takes on its sacramental identity again. And it's something you can feel, like you can sense it. And you think all of those prayers are sort of being answered. So I think it is about moments, because we live in time and space, and so we're kind of preoccupied by that. But everything is truly eternal to God, and therefore, both for good or ill, you can poke back into those. All time is present in the location, in that kind of philosophical way of looking at the world.
And the thing about sacred space is that moment is encapsulated. The moment is alive, not just in the moment it began to become sacred, but that moment lives and jumps back and forth, which creates that timeless feeling. But it also reminds people that their spirituality is not a laissez-faire, in the future, one day God's kingdom, the afterlife, yes. No, all of our spirituality, God's active presence happens in the physical world too. And so the danger of saying, everything spiritual is on the inside, is that we lose the connection with the outside. We lose connection with space, location, community, others, the world. Well, then what? If you got none of that connection and you say, the sacred is only beyond, well, if that was truly true, all religious people finding God would have committed suicide to go and be with, because nothing's present here.
Yeah.
It's kind of Gnostic thinking, isn't it, to suggest that nothing's instantaneous. I mean, one could argue that because of the co-creative principle that we share with God, that God's created us in His image and as co-creators, that actually, for there to be anything sacred, it necessitates human interaction in this world.
Yeah.
I mean, for anything in this world to be sacred, it necessitates a human interaction.
Right. You got to start here, get your base, and then go from there.
Sorry, say that again.
So you have to start here. You have to start small, internally a lot, and then that's your base, and then you grow from there. You have to have a starting point. Yeah. So I do think that we are co-creators of sacred space. Now, that we've talked in the past on this show about thought forms, and people can create their own nightmares
They certainly
around
do.
them.
Yeah.
That's the sort of converse of creating a sacred space, right?
Mm-hmm, it is.
But it's actually the same mechanism. It's just wrongly orientated.
Well, it's about relationship, I think. And I think that's what you're really kind of both getting at, in a sense that there's a relationship between God and man. And it's designed to be that way. It's never supposed to be at the exclusion of one or the other. Because certainly we don't add to God's glory in any way. We don't add to his greatness. We can't subtract from it. There's nothing that even the greatest sins that we do cannot subtract from his perfection. And yet he desires us anyway. He desires a relationship with us in spite of this, that there's nothing that we can add to him. It is strictly about relationship. It's a perfectly unconditional exchange. That is really largely outside of our comprehension, because even the greatest love affairs are usually self-serving when you really break them down. Even the best marriages in the world, would they have happened if that person didn't make you feel good? So there's always, even in the best relationships, there's always something a little bit selfish about it. But with God, it isn't. It is completely selfless in that sense, that his love towards us, because we can't add to it. We can't,
precisely because he doesn't need us.
He doesn't need us.
No.
Yeah, he doesn't need
nothing.
us. Exactly.
Well, is God great if there's nobody to see it?
Yes.
I think so. Well, that's an interesting question, but I think
Absolutely.
So certain things become absolutely meaningless when you are in isolation. And of course, we know that God himself is not in isolation.
Yeah.
Which is why we have a Trinity. God is a community in the God self.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is only expressed in relationship. And to have relationship, you have to have other. So God creates so that there is a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so without the one and the other, you can't actually begin to have the acknowledgement of who God is. Now, whether or not God needed human beings, or if he could have just had a pet cat, look, God can have whatever he wants. He's God.
Yeah.
But there is still a give and take on both sides in the relationship we have with the divine, because we acknowledge what it is, and we affirm it. We reflect it back to itself, and it becomes brighter. If that makes sense. Like looking.
Isn't that what sacred
Absolutely.
spaces do too? I mean, I think about those ancient churches. I mean, I'm blessed. I've been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example.
Yeah.
But even a parish church in the old world, shall we say, to use a very British term, you get the sense that the sacred space feeds back to you. So. You feel like if you're finding it hard to pray, the walls pray for you.
Yes.
I'm not explaining that very well.
No, I understand.
No, I know that from being in nature.
I can't- yeah.
You go back to the same spot every time, and the more you go there and meditate or pray, do the rosary, the more comfortable it is, the more inviting it becomes.
I can't say whether or not the audience can truly understand this or not, but I know exactly what you're saying, because when I walk into the sanctuary at Mass, it absolutely is the entirety of that space praying with me. Now, part of it is the spiritual beings that are present at the Mass that we don't necessarily immediately recognize, and we know they're there. I mean, we know that there are countless angels that attend every Mass. There are saints that attend every Mass. We're not there alone. Even if a priest is saying, you can. Even if a priest is saying the Mass by himself, he's not alone. And for those of us who are sensitive to it, who are opening up ourselves to it, you feel it. It's there. But it's even beyond just even the presence. It's the space itself the otherness. That's why we use, some people wonder why the Holy Nicolaitan Catholic Church uses an iconostasis when it celebrates a Roman Mass. And the reason we have the iconostasis is because of its wonderful contribution to creating a tangible divider of sacred space. It's like bringing us back to the Holy of Holies, Well,
also the Western Church did have the equivalent of an iconostasis.
Yeah, originally,
rood screen.
Yeah, they did.
I was very disappointed when I first heard about rood screens and then found out they weren't rood at all.
They weren't rood at all. We had, when I was
ROOD.
When I was a child, we would go to Mass a few times. That my parents actually wanted to go to Mass, usually around Christmas time. They got into the spirit, I guess. We always went to this convent. I think it was a Cistercian property, and it still had that. It still had the sanctuary area was a screen, and when you went up for Eucharist, you would go up to the screen, kneel down, and there'd be a little door that opens, and the priest
I've never seen that.
out. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you haven't been to any of those kinds of places.
No, not at all. But.
I mean, even if you go to Conyers today, the only monastery nearby to us,
Right.
it's a Cistercian monastery, but it's open enough to the sense. I mean, they do have a separation, but when you go up for Eucharist, you come in.
Still, one of my goals is to get out there for the early
We need
morning
to do
Mass.
it sometime.
One of the wonderful things that again, growing up in England is that although the Reformations happened, many of the churches protected their things from the worst excesses of the reformers. So things like hiding shrines to saints and then restoring them. So I'm from the Diocese of Chester originally. Chester Cathedral was a monastery before the Reformation, and the monks hid the shrine to St. Werburger, and it's been fully restored. It's there now.
Yeah.
And the same is true of a lot of rood screens. But if you go to England and go to some of the Saxon churches, these were the pre-schism churches. So when before the divide between what we now call the Orthodox and the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And you can see the space where you could celebrate either the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom or the Western Rite with absolutely no problem. The architecture is absolutely perfect for both.
Wow.
That's what we kind of strive to achieve. And when we finally do one day build our permanent location, the design of that sanctuary is going to reflect what you just described. Yeah.
And what will happen is that the items that you are using that define sacred in the space you're in, you will obviously take to that spot, and they will be the continuation of the sacredness of where you are now to that location. So the location.
Well, so is the laying on of hands in ordination. That's actually
exactly. Yeah.
the same equivalent.
But Father Firth, you're right about that,
sorry.
because the iconostasis that we have right now is not a fixed piece of furniture. It's basically just a room divider that's been blessed, consecrated, modified with icons attached. And the reason for that, it was originally we would go to many of the different parishioners' homes, and we would do really old school Christianity in the sense of the early church. Just the Mass would be hosted in a different house, and we wanted something that we could take everything with us, including the iconostasis. And that iconostasis, as soon as you set it up, creates the sacred space automatically with very little effort from our part. It's just you put that thing up and all of a sudden you feel it. So, there is definitely so much to what you just said there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because without it, you actually have to embed a space with something sacred, and that space may not have any meaning to you.
Yeah.
Which is why when Jamie said you have a moment, and it's in a location, so you go off and you have your spiritual journey, but you can come back to that bit and you tap in what you experienced. The site remembers, you remember, you're recharged, you put something out, you take something back, and there's this continual flow.
And the more you do it creates a bond, a symbiosis.
Yeah.
And sometimes sacred space, which we grieve, is destroyed, and you cannot rebuild. But items, it could be the wood from a tree. It could be some of the stones from the location. They can be used into something else, and people can carry that sacred moment, everything, the hopes, the fears, the grief, the love, everything that's been put into that location, into another one or into their homes. And that item will have that's made from those bits and pieces will have that feeling. It's also why when we do this callous thing of closing a sacred space to sell it off, and we deconsecrate,
Right.
you walk into the space afterwards. It's sad, but everything's still in there. Like that deep down, like if you wanted to, you could push down and re-find what we've just kind of whitewashed over. But say, oh, it's deconsecrated, it's not sacred anymore.
Well, the footprint's always going to be there.
And the footprint can always be brought back.
Right.
But what it means is that we've never truly understood when people do that, the importance of that space to the people who are using it, and what it means. In Australia the other year, we had an Indigenous site blown up.
What?
Because of $150 million worth of iron ore under it.
Oh my God.
Oh, it's just a gorge. Oh, it's just an Indigenous site. There's nothing there. No one will care. Now, the mining company in question was absolutely shocked at the amount of anger that flowed from not just the Indigenous community, but Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous.
Oh, I'm angry for them. Yeah, that's.
It was the first
horrible.
time here, specifically, that they'd had this anti-destruction of sacred space because people, even though it wasn't their own, suddenly were beginning to realize and building their own connections with the world around them. Instinctually responded, actually, it's wrong and we're going to call it out. And it led to certain directors and board members suddenly having to go.
It is interesting because at the same time, churches across Australia are flogging off buildings. And what I find interesting about that is there's a similar response from local communities that don't go to the church. They're not Christian. They're not particularly interested in that, but they instinctively think that's a bad thing. So because it's a place that's important, even if it's not a place that they utilize.
Yes.
And it shouldn't surprise us, that people instinct. Now, that's not going to make the newspapers, like if an Aboriginal site is blown up, of course. But and it was disgraceful what happened. I remember it at the time. But I do think there's a fascinating thing that very secular people recognize sacred spaces.
I think we're wired for it.
Unless it's something they consider sacred to themselves. Because
yeah.
Well, I think it's because people keep equating religion and spirituality. And if you're not going to a denomination or you're not identifying actively with a religious group, therefore you're not really religious at all. Actually, and that's not true. Human beings, we are innately spiritual. That is one of the biggest defining characteristics of us and any other animal or species on the planet. We are spiritual, and people instinctually have a part of them that yearns and reaches out to try and find that. Now, if their spirituality and their needs have not been able to be met within the group or space where they are, then there's a part of them that says, I'm missing this. And they are more attuned then to the loss of something that is embodied, even if it's not theirs, because it reminds them of they don't have it. They don't have sacred space. They'd like sacred space. That building over there wasn't their sacred space. But at least while it is there in the community, it means that there is an opportunity for sacred space to grow. And I suspect that's why they grieve and are more angry when we close a church and a community that they had nothing to do with, because it's the removal of some form of visible ability to say we acknowledge that sacred space exists.
I also wonder if more denominations said, actually, we can keep, just tell the community we're going to have to close this church, but if you want to send us X, if we raise X amount per year, we'll keep it open for you. I reckon people would do it.
Yes, and in fact, we've had that.
They pay not to go.
We've had that in a couple of communities. When they heard that their churches were going to go, the community have bought them, and they now have them as a community church. Whereas in the community, when they need or want to mark a significant stage in their lives, now they have that building for it. But
we've had a few here in the U.S.
Even have that conversation.
We've had a few in the U.S. Glorious churches, even one that I used to be a part of, the church that was a beautiful Italian-style cathedral where my junior high school was, has since closed and was deconsecrated and was going to be sold off and potentially even demolished. But the community got together and was able to salvage it and keep it as a museum. So that's what we've seen a few cases around here. They're not being used actively as churches anymore. They are continue to be in a deconsecrated state. However, the community saw some at least historical or artistic value in them, and maybe it is some innate.
Yeah, the tabernacle
feeling.
Downtown comes to mind.
Oh, is that
Used to be
another
a
one
church.
like that?
Yeah,
Oh,
now it's a music venue.
Oh, interesting. See, and then I know that there are some around here where they're selling churches and people are converting them into homes, which I wonder what it's like to sleep in those environments. I can imagine when you reawaken the sacred
I was about
space.
to say, what if you're sensitive?
I'm telling you, because most churches are haunted, if not all of them. Okay, we're going to take our break here at the top of the hour. We are talking with Father Firth about sacred spaces, and we'll be right back after this, taking your questions. Don't go away.
Do you believe me that I'm a lonely soul? Would you love me? I've been searching, always wanted more. Can you hear me? Do you believe me that I'm a lonely soul? Would you love me? I've been searching, always wanted more. Can you hear me? my energy. Do you believe me that I'm a lonely soul? Would you love me? I've been searching, always wanted more. Can you hear me? Do you believe me? Got nothing left to lose. So I'll keep waiting for you. It's the only thing that I can do to keep my composure. I need you closer, I want you and only. I want you and only you. I got nothing left to lose. So I'll keep waiting for you. It's the only thing that I can do to keep my composure. Oh, I need you closer. I want you and only you. I want you and so I'll keep waiting for you. It's the only thing that I can do to keep my composure. I need you closer, I want you. So I'll keep waiting for you. It's the only thing that I can do to keep my composure. I need you closer, I want you and only you. Oh, I need you closer, I want you and only you. Oh, I need you closer, I want you and only you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of Vestiges After Dark. We're talking about sacred spaces with Father Firth. And we'd love to hear now your questions and comments. We'd love if you'd call into the show. The number to call is 347-514-7150. That's 347-514-7150. Remember to enter PIN number 3768923 to get placed into the queue. That way we can bring you on the air. If you're calling international, you can call us for free by dialing up on Skype, Eye of the Seer, EYEOFTHESEER. And also, of course, questions in the chat room. We already have some that we're collecting, and when we come back here, we'll get to them. Don't go away. Talking about sacred spaces here, we have my wife Tracy bringing us her
I've already had 2, y'all.
truffles.
I'm not supposed to be eating sugar.
They are very good. The Christmas truffles here, they're fantastic. And, we've been kind of munching on them during the break here. And, well, I mean, what are breaks for if not for that, right?
I mean, it's Christmas time.
It is. And it starts early at this house because,
Yes, it does.
time is very of the essence for me. And if I don't get started early, it won't get done. And I like to go big for Christmas. So we already have 3 trees up.
Yeah, you ought to see his living room, y'all.
Well, I got some pictures up there on
looks
Instagram
good.
if you want to see it. Okay, so we've already got some questions here, and I'm going to put the, let me see if I can go ahead and do that. I'm going to put the number on the screen. There you go. That way, if you have a question, like to call into the show, that's how you reach us. And
Yes, when possible. But maybe you can elaborate on.
yes, our exorcism's supposed to be, and we hang on just a second here. It looks like we are, okay, we had a little bit of we froze for a little bit, but I think we're back here. Yeah, it was definitely, I think they're straddling my internet. Honestly, that's what I think is going on. And they're not supposed to do that. It's really shady business practice, but it's AT&T. So what do you expect from corporate America? Why don't you go ahead, Jamie, and repeat that question, because I'm not sure the audience saw that. I think it was
Calico Benji asked at the closer to the top of the show, aren't exorcisms to be done on consecrated ground? And Father Chris told him yes when possible. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. There are in the Roman Catholic Church, typically it is almost always done inside a church. That is the preferred space because that's sacred space. That's holy ground. All right. Churches are consecrated to God. And the entire environment, the entire ground is changed through that consecration. And so it is very much to the advantage of the exorcist as well as to the victim and the victim's family to have as much help as possible when trying to resolve these cases and bringing a person that's suffering from a demonic attachment that has reached the point of demonic possession to holy ground. Really gives an edge to, those in favor of the church. So it really helps. Now, that's not to say that they can't be done anywhere. Of course, they can be done anywhere. And I've done them in other people's homes before. You've seen that on TV. And if you watch Ghost Adventures, you've seen me do exorcisms in other people's homes. Those are not holy. That's not holy ground, although I do try to bless the home before we get started with stuff like that, just to create, again, sacred space, to give grace to that environment so that the environment becomes part of the prayer. I mean, that's really what the Mass is. When you really look and break down the elements of the Mass, the parts of the Mass, why do we use incense? And that's so that your nose can pray. It's not just vocalizations. Prayer is not just vocalizations.
We're hitting all five senses.
You want all five senses involved. When you taste the Eucharist, your tongue becomes part of the prayer. Your taste buds become part of the prayer. When you smell the incense, your nose becomes parts of the prayer. When you chant, your ears become part of the prayer. And all of that is part of the intimacy of that experience, that relationship that we were talking about earlier. So ideally, yes, you would want to have an exorcism performed in a holy space, but you can do it in a person's home. It's just not desired or preferable. And another side to that is you kind of want to fight on your own turf.
Right.
I mean, think about it from
you
street smarts.
You always want to be the one on the higher ground.
You want to be on the higher ground, and you want it to be your territory that you're.
Position of
Think
Overwatch.
about everyone knows the film The Exorcist, and that was based on a real case, right?
Oh,
it was actually
loosely.
It was a boy. It was a male that was involved in it, and yes, the exorcisms began at the home because the boy was very sick.
Right.
But eventually he was moved to a monastery.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where the final exorcisms took place.
Yeah. The priest did not throw himself out a window in real life.
No.
I watched. There was a documentary on it on TV here a week or so ago. Hour and a half documentary.
Yeah.
And it showed a clip of you and Jamie exercising.
The Dateline Australia.
Yeah.
Documentary. Yeah, we were on there quite a bit.
No, this wasn't the Dateline one. This was a documentary on the Exorcist case. But they went to a sort of vignette of you two doing the exorcism of that.
No, you'll have to show that to me, because I guarantee you they don't have the rights to that content.
Probably not.
Well, I think it was on TLC.
I hope it was my good side.
Oh, was it? Okay.
And
That's
TLC have the
Discovery.
rights to Ghost Adventures.
Yeah,
so
that's
I
under
suspect-
Discovery. Yeah.
I suspect they might.
They might have the rights then. Yeah.
But anyway, just an example of, sometimes you have to begin in someone's home because they're incapacitated or they're ill,
bedridden.
But as soon as it's possible, it's in the church. Because of course they should be in the church anyway.
They should.
That's the final remedy, right?
I mean, well, you wouldn't even really most likely need the remedy if I mean, look, I know that there are cases. I mean, obviously, God has multiple ways in which he reaches out to us. And sometimes it can be through, I guess, the way it's looked at is testing our weaknesses. And so there can be very devout people that suffer from something as extreme as a demonic attachment, even a demonic possession. It's happened. But typically speaking, if we're talking about just what we typically see, spiritual apathy is the predominant cause in these cases. And then you can go down and see, well, what caused the spiritual apathy? And that's when you'll find that there's other factors. But, if people are seeing the church for what it ultimately is, what it really is in truth, looking past the grouchy, sadistic parishioners that you're inevitably going to encounter there, the lack of feeling welcome, you're going to encounter that too. The gossip and the bickering and everything else that happens in a church.
There's only one thing worse than not being welcomed at church, and that's being welcomed.
Isn't that the truth? Because then you're in with the wrong crowd typically. But
I just want to sit in the back and be left alone.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, I know what you mean. I would either sit all the way in the front or all the way in the back, because if I was in the front, then
celebrate the mass, or I'll just pray at the back.
Yeah.
We were kind of in between growing up as a child. We were like the fourth row from the back.
See, that was
and
just
everybody
too
knew
involved
that's
for
where
me.
we sat.
That was
it was almost designated seating. You could tell where everybody was going to be. New people show up, be like, you can't sit there, miss you know who's going to be sitting there.
That's right.
But it's interesting. You will always have picked a spot to go,
right?
Even if nobody had even if you didn't know where anyone else preferred to sit. They're in the space. There'll be a part of you that will connect to a particular portion of it. And that's where your family will just naturally gravitate to.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to see the animosity when somebody new or a visitor entering
That's what I'm saying. You get somebody new show up. I'm sorry, Miss
Has that
Gladys has
same-
been sitting there for 25 years. You move your butt.
That's what, I mean, there can be 5 empty pews right next to
Right.
it, but they pick that one, and you go, and you can see the drama unfolding
Oh yeah.
because people link to the space and their spiritual moment and their spiritual need.
Well, it's why I used to challenge the regulars. I used to say, because they generally sit towards the back of the church, right? Because that's what people do. And I used to say, how easy is it for somebody who's new to this church or in the community recently or just visiting on holiday, whatever, to walk into the church and have to walk past all of you and get to the front of the church?
Right.
Like sit further forward, let them take the back seats.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, that's welcome.
Yeah.
But, like Father Walter was saying, I mean, if you want to empty your church, tell them to move seats.
No, it's true. It's true.
You get comfortable where you're sitting and the people in front of you and behind you, it becomes so familiar, it's almost
It's also
territorial.
how dioceses go down the drain because people are attached to those seats and to those buildings, rightly
Yeah.
so. I'm not being cynical about that. But then all of a sudden, the leadership of a diocese is not Christian at all, but they just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
I
because
remember
that's
when
where they go.
the church that I served at while I was a seminarian in Palm Beach, Florida, had a pew, St. Edward's Church. It's a beautiful church. If you're ever in the area, it's definitely worth going to see. It's quite remarkable. It's a missionary church. The entire ceiling is layered in gold leaf. It's really something for the United States of America, let me tell you. And beautiful art. It's not a typical American-looking church. It's very much in the European old style. But there's a pew there about halfway up on the right, and there's a plaque that says John F. Kennedy sat here because when the Kennedy family always had a home in Palm Beach, and when they were in Palm Beach, that was their parish because that was the only Catholic church on the island, and it's a small island. So, you didn't need more than one, but they had to have that little plaque there so that when John F. Kennedy went to mass, that's where he would sit. So I don't really see people really chopping at the bit to sit there, but it had the plaque if you were interested. Wanted to know that you were sitting right where he sat.
But it's more than that. That ties the space, a moment of time, a person that mattered to the community
And was taken from the community.
into that location, into that moment. And so you are connecting to everything that's happened before when you're in that space. And if you really liked the Kennedys or the U.S. political system, or that's your passion,
or one of the other American royal families,
you will connect. Like you will have a moment of connection because you sat in Kennedy's chair. Now somebody else comes along and goes, "It's just a pew," but it's not just a pew. It's only a pew to you, but not to everybody.
But that's about assigning value, isn't it? I mean, because if you think, like, I actually preached about this on Sunday, so I'll try not to repeat a sermon. But
All 45 minutes of it, Father.
Yeah, well, the gospel passage was, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's, which is, genius. The separation of church and state in one sentence is amazing. But I was just talking about value, and I watched that TV show Porn Stars, and when I was there, after I'd left you, I went to Vegas.
You went to Vegas and went to the pawn shop.
We went to the shop, of course.
Found out how tiny it was.
Yeah, it is tiny. And I love that show. I think it's a really good show. But inevitably, what happens is people come and they bring something that they value and they put it on the counter. And then, of course, the conversation's had about what it's worth in dollars.
Right.
And there's always that uncomfortable relationship between the value a person has to this item and what it's worth in dollars today, in this current market, whatever it may be. And then also the complete unrealization that some people that it's not a museum but a shop and he needs to make money on it. What I was kind of contemplating, when we elevate the Eucharist in the Mass, we're all there gathered in that space, valuing beyond all things that item. And but of course, if I put a piece of the same piece of bread onto the counter at the pawnbrokers, I wouldn't expect them to offer me anything for it. So that's about.
Let us hope they wouldn't. Let us hope they wouldn't, because then they would know what they had there.
Yeah, and ultimately, when it comes to God, the only thing that we can offer on the counter is ourselves.
Yeah.
We've got nothing to offer God. God needs nothing from us, but he desires our free will love of him.
Yes.
And that's all. So we put ourselves on the counter, and there's a sort of synergy between we put ourselves on the counter, he puts himself on the altar.
Well, because I think to God, if I might be so bold to say this, but I think I'm on solid ground by saying this. I think the sacred space to God, if there is such a thing, is freedom. And so that is ultimately what he desires. We were talking earlier about why would he even need couldn't he have just gone with a cat or something, why human beings? I think really what it is an expression of the sacredness of freedom, and to create an entity that it embodies that, which is why we fell in the first place, incidentally, because we had this immense power that we weren't able to contain. It takes on a life of its own. And I think it's part of that, oh, happy fault. It was part of the design in a way, that knowing, yes, okay, I'm going to create this entirely free entity, this entity that is the archetype of freedom, and it's going to go badly, but we'll fix it in the end. But it's a remarkable thing, because I think that is the ultimate sacred space. And what is the United States of America if not built upon, at least in principle, maybe not in practice, but in principle, the archetype of freedom, a space that was reserved to be sacred space of freedom. It doesn't do a great job of it anymore, but it was at least initially set up to be just that.
Well, there's a concept that's entered the lexicon in America. As you know, I listen to the Daily Wire every day, and they replay, the sort of current events. And obviously, it's been the midterms, and it's all been politics. But there's a phrase that's been used commonly. It's been used by your president, and they talk about the sacred voting, or the sacred right to vote.
Yeah,
it's not sacred.
It's a privilege.
That's not correct.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom is sacred.
Yes.
But the right, voting is not sacred. It's a democratic act. It's a duty and a responsibility and a right that's been fought for with blood, sweat, and tears. I'm not saying that voting is not important, but it says something about a culture when that is called sacred.
The word's been so misused, it's lost a lot of its meaning.
It's actually our word. By our word, I don't mean the Catholic Church. I mean, it's a spiritual religious word.
Well,
it belongs in the realm of religion.
There has been a slow degradation, I think, in the United States of America to move in this secular direction but retain some of the spirit of its more spiritual days. Again, America was never entirely a Christian nation. It was founded by deists, and it had at least at its heart an understanding of God. Maybe not a perfect one, but maybe one better than any other of the time. But it's moved away from that, even to the point that there are people that would love to take the word God out of the Pledge of Allegiance. In fact, they've even modified. There are groups that have modified the Pledge of Allegiance.
Most schools don't even do it anymore.
They don't do it because they see it as
Right.
offensive. Taking a prayer out of school, or taking the moment of silence. I remember being in public school. They didn't do prayer. They didn't, and I was we're talking like the 70s and 80s now, when I was in grammar school. They didn't do prayer, but they did have a moment of silence. And in that moment, whatever your spiritual connection would be, you could use that time to make your sacred space. It was a moment
See,
of sacred
I
space.
went to state secondary school and to a grammar school.
Mm-hmm.
We had prayer.
Yeah.
We sang hymns every. It wasn't a Christian school. It was a state school.
Wow.
We sang hymns and we had prayers every day.
That did not happen here, at least not
we
in my.
did the Pledge
It
of
doesn't
Allegiance
happen in
every
England
morning.
anymore either.
No, it
but-
doesn't. Yeah. So they've been moving away from it. So all this to say, back to the point, I think that's why you're starting to see this religious language being interwoven into the political stream, because now the theology of America is science and politics.
Yeah, there's your new religion.
That's the religion.
And therefore,
People
church
need sacred space. So
Yes.
they will create the sacred. They will find things to invest the sacred into.
Yes.
If you talk about freedom and liberty, if you were not from the US, you could argue calmly that all of that liberty and freedom that the US has promoted itself on or believes in never actually existed in the US. It is actually a myth.
Yeah.
That's all right. But the moment you feel yourself being triggered by a statement like that, then you know that it's built into your understanding of story, location, and identity. And when you have that in your background, we're about freedom, liberty, the people, all of a sudden, where do you express that? And if that's become your identity, where is the space you show that? It's not church, it's in voting. It's in attending your political rallies. And that becomes a vehicle. How many people are offended that there was a riot at Capitol Hill?
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have been upset or as upset if that riot had happened at the church or at the community hall or in the local schoolyard.
true.
They burned stuff down and people got killed and nothing was done.
Yeah. That's true.
Because the space embodies what's important to them. And
Right.
there's a fine line between saying, oh, this space is right or wrong. It's irrelevant. People believe it. And it's how people invest into sacred space, which I believe would tie into the second question along in the chat room.
Well, let's hold that question for just a second, because we actually have a caller here from the 208 area code in Idaho. Hello, you're on the air.
Idaho.
Hi, Bishop. Hi, Jamie. It's Paula.
Hey,
Hey,
Paula.
Paula.
How's it going? Good talking with you.
I wanted to ask, I don't know if Speak Father First was maybe actually going to just about to answer my question, but I have recently I took an old room. It's kind of I think it's supposed to be a dining room, and kind of converted it into what I like to call a prayer room.
Right.
But I never thought about it before, and I'm wondering, is there anything that I can do in additional, to make it a sacred place? I had never, until hearing this evening, I'd never actually thought about, that it could actually become a true sacred place. I just thought of it as a place that I went to say my rosary, read my Bible, and that sort of thing.
Sure. Father First, how do you make, how does a layperson make a space in their home sacred?
All right. First of all, when it comes to any space that is going to become sacred, there's no such thing as lay and ordained. We're all the same. It's a natural act of every human being. And what you put into the space to make it meaningful will vary from person to person and culture to culture. For example, Jacob from the Old Testament has a dream. Sees the angels ascending and descending the ladder. Get the story of Jacob's ladder from that. What does he do? He piles up some rocks. That's what makes the space, that location, sacred. He doesn't do anything else. He holds the memory by along with that pile of rocks in that location, and then we make the guy as a hero later on. Just a normal guy had a moment. When we're intentionally trying to make a space sacred, the danger is that we actually start looking for the professionals to do their magic. And if I were to make it my sacred space, it may not be yours. So one of the big things about sacred space is that the space has one intention, and that intentionality that you take to it is what it will embody. If that's the room you go into to have an argument with your loved ones, that's what that room is going to embody for you.
Yeah.
If that's a space you use to be your truest self, to explore the things that are really in your heart, the troubling questions that you may not want to speak aloud to other people, the space where you actually question what you're doing in life, then that space will begin to embody that future journey, which brings your past automatically into it. And not a poisonous past, because that's not there. And items that matter to you and focus your way of being spiritual are what you put there. Now, for some people, that may be an icon. Now, in my background, just here, there is an icon. I traveled through Turkey from one side of Russia to the other, and that is the only real icon I bought the whole time, because it was the only one that spoke to me. Thousands of icons were for sale everywhere I went, and be amazed at how many people tried to sell them to me, but they did not speak to me. Anything that is a religious foci should be speaking to you. That's part of what makes an icon an icon. For somebody else, that could be a statue of Mary, but a statue of Mary may be absolutely incongruent to you. You may not see the gentleness of a young mother in her stern look and the way that the craftsman has made that statue. Putting a statue like that, then, that doesn't make you feel a connection with God, embodying the Mary that you know, that statue is not going to help. And so those items have to connect with you, who you are, what you're doing. So your rosary beads, if you're praying the rosary, what do you sit on? Is that a chair you've just dragged in from the kitchen? Is it a chair you're just using? Is it a prayer desk? Is it a particular cushion? Where do you sit your rosary beads after that? All of those little things are all intentional, where you put them, what you've got there. And the distractions that don't feed into that, like a television, a picture of your old house, if it doesn't draw you back to a spiritual location, all of those things are suddenly redundant and actually take away from the space. And the more you spend time in there doing just spiritual things, meditating, staying calm, praying, reading things that help answer the questions of your purpose in life, where you're going, what you're doing, how you should live. Now, that may be sacred text. It could be somebody else's sacred text. They could be theological works. There is no right, wrong answer with that. And those things will build up meaning. If you have a family Bible that matters to you, because the connection with family, the past, it tells a future for where you're going, then I would have that in that room too. Because that all adds to your spiritual identity being encapsulated in that one location.
Does that answer your question, Paula?
Absolutely, that was perfect. Makes me feel like that room is exactly what it's supposed to be.
It does sound as though it's an organic process. It doesn't sound like we have to do a whole lot to make this happen, except to have the intention to use the room in the way that it's
I-
being
I-
used?
I do
Yeah.
think. I mean, I'm aware, Paula, that you're a practicing Catholic, and so I do think that there's one thing that Catholics really ought to do, which is they ought to have a home altar. Now, what I don't mean
I have
building
one.
I don't mean building an 8-foot long, thing that a priest can actually celebrate the mass at.
Why
but
not?
I mean,
Why not?
Mine's about half that size.
I didn't preclude it, but at the very least, there ought to be a table with a cloth on it, with a cross, a crucifix, an icon, some kind of light, whether it's a candle or an oil
You just
lamp.
described mine. Almost did it.
yeah.
Have you been at my
And
house? What's going on?
He's got a camera there. You don't
Yeah,
know
what's
it.
going on there?
And like I say, this is the minimum. I think Father Walter explained something a lot deeper than this, but the reason that every Catholic should have that is because if you're sick or incapacitated and the sacrament needs to be brought to you, whether by a layman or a clergyman, that's where it goes whilst they're praying for you and giving you communion by extension.
Yeah.
So as a very minimum, you should have that. And I think from that minimal minimum standard, you can then add to that in terms of the sorts of things that Father Walter was saying. But I would encourage, look, my idea of a sacred space, like Father Walter says, is not going to be the same idea as everybody else's.
Right.
I prefer darker spaces, for example, because I like candlelight. I like the light of an oil lamp. I like the way it lights up icons, and I like icons because they help me to think about something outside of myself, and I have a little incense burner, and I burn some incense.
Same.
That's not going to be the same for everybody else,
Right.
but that's where I'm at. But at the very least, if I was sick, somebody could bring me communion and have a dignified place to put it, and a place that's set aside, which is really the meaning of consecrated land. It's that it's set aside for this. And I'm not talking about a formal consecration of your prayer space, but it's a space that's set aside for that purpose, just like your kitchen's set aside for cooking food.
Yeah. Well, Paula, there you go. I think you're ready to go.
Perfect. I do. I've got my altar. I'm good to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Outstanding,
calling
Paula.
in. That was a great question. And I'm sure one that will
Thank
help.
you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. It surely would be one that will help a lot of people too, because I'm sure that's on a lot of people's minds who are watching this and will be watching this in the archive. So, actually,
Everybody needs
fantastic
their own
question.
altar at the house.
I think that's always a good move.
Right.
What is the difference, though?
For some people, spirituality and their religious journey, they need an altar at their house. Because if somebody is not a Christian, them putting an altar into their house it's like a form of cultural appropriation.
Oh, I'm talking about altar, just period. Like,
Yeah. So I wouldn't expect somebody who an altar has no meaning for to suddenly go, oh, I've got an altar in my house, because
By definition, they wouldn't.
yeah.
yeah,
So they'd have a table.
Let's be honest, what most people have is a 60-inch plasma TV because that's what they worship.
I mean, that's one way to put it. Yeah,
It's true.
Sorry, I'm
It's
being
true. Although I
naughty.
think most religions have some kind of altar or equivalent.
right.
When you look
we,
at
we
it,
call it an altar because that's what we do.
Buddhism has
Yeah.
altars.
All my pagan
Hinduism
friends
has
have
altars. I mean, I guess
Only really Islam doesn't.
only really Islam. I mean, even I've known even Jewish families that have a little sacred corner, a little place with, that they put sacred items. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to be very careful with the word altar, simply because the language of the word may have a completely different correspondence to a sacred corner or sacred grove or sacred shelf that somebody else may have had. I'm not saying other religious groups don't have altars or an equivalent. Just
As an aside, though, I mean, mantelpieces above fires were used by and continue to be used by clergy. They were certainly used following the Reformation for priests to celebrate Mass in secret where they lived. So in public worship, they had to go into the church on the Sunday and read the prescribed text from the king. But then they, went into their presbyteries and closed the door and celebrated the mass on the mantelpiece.
So what would you say then is the difference? And this is a question for either of you, if whoever wants to answer it first, or I'm sure you both have input. What would you say, or how would you, in your own words, describe the difference between what we just told Paula to do and what you just mentioned, Father, a little bit ago about formal consecration of a space? What would you say is the difference between those two things, if there is any?
Because it's me that said I'll go first, but okay. I'll leave plenty of gaps for Father Walter. The way I see consecration is to be done over a place that is going to be set aside permanently for worship. This is in the Christian understanding. Right. I don't really believe in deconsecration. I mean, I understand what people are saying, but like we've said, it's not like all of a sudden all of those souls that have prayed
all the history, all the masses, all the energy just disappear.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Right.
And that's why, for example, it always used to be the custom, it probably still is, that institutional churches won't consecrate a building until it's paid for. Mm-hmm. In other words, if there's a mortgage on it, it won't be consecrated.
Interesting.
You've got to wait until you know.
Do not own.
Yes. Yeah. So it's got to be wholly owned. And then because look, if I once I wonder that mythical day when I pay off my mortgage on the house that I live in, if I don't die before that happens, then actually I'll then truly own my house and be able to do whatever I like with it. Well, apart from the tyranny of government telling me what I can and can't do, but
and taxing you on it.
We have taxes.
Yeah, that's right. So, but since I don't own this house entirely. Even if I have got a space where I can celebrate Mass at home, but I will not consecrate that land because it's not mine to consecrate.
Gotcha.
Not yet. So I think consecration is where it's formal, and I think, in my opinion, it has to be a bishop that does that as well. The idea is that the successor of the apostles comes and, in a sense, puts St. Paul's tent over that space. And says, well, as the primary representative of the church in this age, this space is set aside for divine worship. And it's why, when we have a real altar with an altar stone, we have the relics of the saints in there.
Right.
Which, is an unbroken tradition. So that's what I understand. Like, for example, I bless my house. I bless anybody's house that'll ask me. That's not consecrating the property.
Right.
Right.
A house blessing is not the same thing.
But then again, there's even that. There's a distinction between the sacramental blessing that a priest would come in to give to a home and the blessing the homeowner could confer on the house.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So what is that? What is that difference in terms of sacred space? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
Father Walter, why don't you take care?
One of those is the public official action. It's a bit like a baptism. Your grandma can do a baptism of the grandkids in the bath or under the sink.
And should real. If you refuse to do so yourself.
It's real, it's valid, but there is something missing on an official public declaratory level.
Yeah.
And when you bring in a religious official to do something, it makes it official. There's an outside affirmation that this has occurred, that this space is set aside for something. And I think that's the same sort of thing that comes when you have a room that has only one purpose. So if you were in an old home, now I'm hoping one of you really loves architecture and can feed the word in here. It was the room called an oratory, where the landed gentry would have a room where the owner of the house actually went in and they just prayed. I know they could have a chapel on their place too,
Right.
but inside the building there was a room, and because of the space, like the size of the room, it could have no other real purpose other than to contain a prayer desk for a person to be able to kneel on their prayer desk, read scripture. Obviously comes out of England, so you're using. So you may have even been using the daily office from the Book of Common Prayer. So, and if you buy one of those houses, and you're looking at the house plan, the room has its little name on it. It's not a bedroom, bathroom, a walk-in wardrobe. It has only that purpose.
Yes.
And so and when we are intentionally going to have a space that is consecrated to something, or we're officially making it that is dedicated completely for that one purpose, ideally into perpetuity, then we actually change the demarcation of what that room is. A bit like if you were to buy a house which had an open plan living, and suddenly decide you want an extra bedroom. So you wall off a section of that open plan dining area, and then you suddenly are putting onto the council plans, or when you resell the house in the future, instead of that 3-bedroom open plan living home that you bought, you've now got a 4-bedroom home with a living space at the other end. And anything else, we are essentially only really dedicating and setting aside for an intended purpose in that interim.
I do think, though, if somebody is a Christian and has set up a deliberate sacred space, even if it's the corner of their room, Danielle's just said, it could be a cupboard under the stairs. It doesn't matter. It's not about how grand it is or how attractive it is.
Right, mine's a corner in the office.
Yeah, so mine's in a storeroom. It's just this side of the wall, and so it's not about the beauty of it. Although obviously beauty is part of sacredness. But
it's in the words. You both used particular words there. You said yours is in the corner of your office. Mm-hmm. Yours is in a storeroom. So you've actually put. You've actually put the sacred space within the space of another room. Mm-hmm. And you have and that's not to say you don't have the sacred space, but you also have the amazing ability to pick that sacred space back out and put it somewhere else if you needed to or you desired to.
Right, of course.
Or you wanted to expand it. And it's not limited. And I would say that's because the intentionality of what you're doing with the sacred space is within the frame of where you've sat it, rather than being specifically trapped in as this building is. It's why we can't take that sacred space out of a building that we've called a church.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, as a Christian, we ought to use the things the Christian church provides to establish our sacred spaces. So, if one's of a tradition that uses holy water, then yes, you could ask a priest to come and bless your sacred space. There'd be no problem there'd be no objection from most priests I know. We are supposed to bless houses every Epiphany, at least, anyway, in the Western tradition. But certainly, obtaining holy water from your local parish church and having that in your sacred space, sprinkling it there. These are all things that we ought to do if we are Christians, and that's, we use the sacramentals of the church to demarcate this space.
Well, I think that's also the bringing home of the sacramentals of the palms on Palm Sunday. Mm-hmm. Is a way of the laity being able to bring some of that formal sacredness into their homes in a way that
we do have to avoid one danger, though. There's one danger in this, because I think all of this is really
talismans
good stuff to do.
Talismans.
Well, no, the danger is
Call it a
thinking
talisman.
that sacred space is where God is,
Right.
and I only have to think about sacred things when I'm there.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
There's one of the risks of that.
Well, that's a form of idolatry, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So that's just a caution.
But if you've got a space where you intentionally think about the divine and what the divine seeks from you and how you should be, then you would take that with you because you then aim to live it. So you start to try and embody that ideal. If you do not sit in that space and actually go, who is this God? What's that mean to me? Which is essentially what we do with readings in any religious institution. We pull apart readings at particular times of a week to tell people how they're meant to apply to their lives. You do that with sacred text in that sacred space, and then you go out and live. If you're not doing that, well, then actually you're not really asking those questions. You're not really spending that time in conversation. And so you never really sat in that room and thought about God and what he wanted of you. Because if you did, you wouldn't have walked back out and done exactly what you're doing that he probably wouldn't have wanted you to be doing when you walked into the space to actually think about it.
Yeah, otherwise it's just a Lucky Charm room for you.
Yeah, that's true. What's our next question, Jamie?
So Moosh had one way up thread, and it actually discusses deconsecration. She says, Bishop, you have done deconsecrations. Wouldn't a certain vibration remain regardless? We may have already answered that.
I mean, we kind of did. I mean, yes. I mean, I think deconsecration essentially is just formally saying that. Well, let me say that what I do is slightly different than maybe what the Roman Catholic Church does. When I deconsecrate a space that I have used, and typically this is strictly for the place that is reserved for the Mass, allowing us to have this space, being able to utilize this space for the consecration of your body and blood and for communion and prayer with you. But I now return it to the realm of the mundane for other uses. And that's essentially how I go about doing it, because the intention behind it was always, and again, this is because I knew that this would not be a permanent location. But I also knew it'd be long enough that we'd be having hundreds of, if not thousands of liturgies there. So I didn't want it to just be a room that we used. I wanted it to be more formal than that. But I also knew that this was not the end goal of this church. So I kind of did some in-between work there in that respect. But yes, deconsecration is kind of basically more like saying that you are, through the authority that has been given to you in the church, at least in terms of a successor to the apostles and in the form of a bishop, that you're returning to that space a sense of normalcy now, now it can be used for other things.
I was going to say, it's actually about authorization.
It is about authorization. Because my bishop, one of the things that he always instructed all of his priests and some of them didn't know this, and they should know this, but some of them didn't. And that is that if you were to ever use a consecrated vessel or item, because obviously you can consecrate more than just a room or a building. You can consecrate, obviously a chalice is consecrated, a paten's consecrated, the holy objects that are utilized at the Mass are consecrated objects. Sacrilege. But if you were to take a chalice and pour yourself a cup of milk and have some cookies with it at night, if a priest were to do that with his chalice,
let's not do that.
I'm sure there's probably some nutty priest out there that has tried this, but I mean, let's just say that there's a priest out there that did do this. You have now deconsecrated that vessel by virtue of using it in a mundane way. So
You profaned it.
You profaned
Yeah.
it, yes. And so basically deconsecration is saying that through authority, we allow this space to return to normal use, or we allow this object to return to normal use. It's a way of sort of giving dignity to God, saying, thank you for letting us use this, and now we return it to its original purpose or its original assuming it wasn't a place that was built for the purpose.
Well, it's a bit like laicizing a priest, right?
It's kind of like that. Yeah, they're always a priest, but they lose their authority. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly the way you look at it.
They're also relieved of the obligation.
Yes.
Because I think also when it came to, if you think of the tradition of deconsecrating holy ground,
Yes.
it was basically giving permission for the clergy that had to live there and offer the sacrifice there.
Correct.
Permission not to anymore.
Yes. Yes.
It was releasing them because if a place is consecrated, and again, if we think of a pre-Vatican II church, which is always a nicer thing to contemplate as far as I'm concerned, but if we think of a pre-Vatican II church, the clergy had to say their daily office in that space,
Yes.
had to offer a daily mass in that space. So the deconsecration says no longer are you obliged to do that, and it's a public act, right?
Yes.
That's why the bishop comes. It's authorized and it's official to say this is no longer going to be a place that binds a clergyman to it,
Yes.
or is exclusive to all things other than the worship of God.
Yes. When we're
It
going to
doesn't
take
remove what happened there. Can't change what happened there.
Right.
we're going to take our next break here, the top of the hour. We'll be right back, and when we return, I'm going to now shift gears a little bit, and we're going to ask about cursed spaces and see how that relates to, if any way, to the idea of a sacred space. So don't go away.
Burning me up. Don't fight the fire. Too much, too fast to burn us out. We walk the wire, love. Don't make me read your mind. I know it. Learning to trust, learning to trust. It's never enough, never enough. Burning me up, burning me up. I won't fall when I'm picking you up. Hold my hand, I won't be strong enough. Our love is stronger, and I'll be here. My lead, now we're taking the jump. My pride, cause I know you're the one. Our love is stronger. Baby, I know that it's stronger than yesterday. Sparks igniting. We left some space for us to breathe. My head is quiet now. I can rest in peace, cause you are more than enough, more than enough. Feeling the rush, feeling the rush. Burning in love, burning in love. Two souls united. This roaring blaze is soaring free. If you ever get tired, love, I'll sing you gently to sleep, cause you're still more than enough, more than enough. Feeling the rush, feeling the rush. Burning in love, burning in love. I won't fall when I'm picking you up. With my hand, I won't be strong enough. Our love is stronger, and I'll be here. My lead, now we're taking the jump. My pride, cause I know you're the one. Our love is stronger. Baby, I know that it's stronger than yesterday.
Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final hour of Vestiges After Dark. Tonight, we are talking with Father Firth about sacred spaces and taking your questions as well. The number to call is 347-514-7150. That's 347-514-7150. Enter PIN number 3768923 to be put into the queue. You can also call us free internationally on Skype by dialing up Eye of the Seer. We'll be right back after this. Okay, well, I think we've very much established that sacred spaces can be produced organically, even without much conscious attention given, being that as long as a space is used long enough for a particular purpose, it starts to develop characteristics or embody the energy of that energy. So, for example, if there's a space in one's home where there's a lot of arguments, then that would become absorbed into that environment and could reflect negatively on the people that would reside there. And I think that we see this certainly with cursed objects where, you know, we've talked about the nature of haunted dolls or haunted stuffed animals, and you know my feelings on this. Dybbuk boxes, yes, exactly. Although I think the Dybbuk box makes it seem like, you know, all these Jewish people are just producing all these boxes and throwing spirits in them. I mean, that just doesn't happen. You know, they make it seem like there's all these, you know, all of them out there, and no, it's not quite the way that works. But Dybbuks are a real thing, and certainly, you know, negative energy can be harnessed. I think that's actually what the Dybbuk box is, to be honest. I don't think there's really an entity in there. I think well, there is technically an entity, I guess, because I think it's a thought form. But I think if there's anything to be said about the story of the woman who created it, I think she infused within it. She was a Holocaust survivor, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
She was trying to localize her pain, right?
Yes.
Right.
And all of that torture that she went through emotionally and physically was projected into this object, and
she should have then just burnt it. It would have been quite cathartic.
Actually, it would have been. Keeping it is you know, it keeps it alive in a way. And so when I came near the Dybbuk box, I felt nothing evil from it. I felt nothing but sadness and sorrow.
That's exactly what I felt.
And I've known other people that have felt
here.
the same thing. You felt it too. Yeah, you went to the museum, so yeah, you saw it. So let's talk about cursed spaces and cursed objects. I mean, you know, something along those lines. They happen organically too, as long as there's enough negativity happening around, even if people aren't intending to make their home a cursed space. by bringing in hostility and violence into a location, you sort of create a cursed environment. So, what are your thoughts on that, Father Firth? And what should people do to resolve that? I mean, would you say it's as easy as just shifting gears and doing good, happy, peaceful things in the space in place of it, or does more need to be done in order to shift the environment from something that's extremely negative to something positive again?
Okay, I'll try breaking down your multiple questions
Go for
into chunk-sized bits that hopefully people can follow bit by bit.
Okay.
So when we talk about space where people have died or the dead are, one of our big modern things, especially with supernatural TV shows, horror movies, is to make that space bad. There is nothing more peaceful than a graveyard. Graveyards are where we have laid the dead to rest. There is a sacredness about them that is gentle. They're not an evil, bad, or negative spiritual site. So there was a question by Not Sure about that. I thought this is a beautiful segue between positive sacred space and ambiguity.
Well, yeah, I mean, these people that are buried there have received the proper rites of Christian burial. Everything that could possibly have done right was done right in those cases. So, yeah, cemeteries are wonderful.
There's a safety and a gentleness in those spaces. So there's no problem about them. So if you lived near a graveyard or cemetery, hey, you've got a great space right next to you.
Most priests live by them.
Which is spiritually peaceful.
Yeah.
When it comes to negative sacred spaces, and actually it's interesting, some religious spaces where people worship are they're not positive, they're not negative, they are neutral sacred space. By that, they utilize the buildings for their prayer and spirituality, and they take that back out with them when they leave. So traveling through some places where particular Catholic churches or mosques, because people don't leave their spirituality behind them, they're bringing their prayers in with them and taking them out. They don't necessarily leave the space, and you can feel not a negative, not a or a positive. So I don't mean it in a bad way,
right.
But there can be nothing different about this. Attractive building, marvelous architecture, but not necessarily a spiritual feed that one can tap because people haven't left it in the space. Now, there is one place in my journeys and travels around the world where I couldn't walk. Now, I am a migraine sufferer, so I know when these things are coming on, when these are things that are natural, normally produced. Nothing medically kicked in that was normal here.
Mm-hmm, right.
We were in Myanmar. So we were crossing, we went over the bridge over River Kwai. No problem with that bit. Then all of a sudden we're walking down a hill, along a narrow track. And the more I walked, the heavier things became, the sicker I got. My head was being crushed. I was just so repulsed. I could not enter the cave we ended up at. My wife went in there, said to the guide, they had no problems with it. I knew something was wrong. This space was sick. Like, it was horrible. Like, this was worse than like, I've been with people who are dying, no problems. Like, you're talking about something so torturously wrong that every part of me was crying, screaming, this was bad. This was sick. Turned out Japanese soldiers committed harikari in there.
Oh,
rather
interesting.
than surrender, because the atrocities they'd committed. They knew what punishment was awaiting them, so they went into that cave and killed themselves instead.
Wow.
Well, it's an honorable death to them.
Well, that space will tell you otherwise.
Right. Well, they're still wrong,
well.
things they did.
Well,
but-
yeah, and the moment the guy, because I could still hear him talk, I just could not go in. I couldn't even stand.
Yeah.
I was sitting on a rock outside, and the guy's like, "Oh yes," and in this, that is why I cannot enter that space. And it was so bad,
Yeah.
it would take something monumental, a monumental feat, well beyond the scope of what I could imagine to repair the trauma done to land. Because you're not talking about a simple blessing or exorcism.
Right.
You're talking about something that has bled so deeply into the location.
Well, you literally have the blood of innocence, burrowed into the ground there.
And people who knew what they were doing and delighted in torture and evil, the further we walked away, the happier I got.
I bet.
The endorphins kicked in. It was just such a release. I was skipping by the time we went off to find a spot for lunch. And if I had not had that experience, I mean, yes, I've been in old jails. Australia has a horrible history of convict abuse in prisons, Port Arthur, places like that. I've been in there. There's a sadness in there. Nothing like this.
What
And,
about, have either of you been to Auschwitz or the Tower of London or places where...
I had in my head.
Yeah,
I don't
like,
think I could go.
have you been to either of those places?
I've been to the Tower of London. When I was a Metropolitan Policeman, I could go there for free. And the Tower is a dark place.
Yeah.
What have you been there, Father Firth? Have you been?
No.
Have you been to Auschwitz?
I have been very careful to avoid a lot of places where actions of the Holocaust occurred.
Yeah.
Because I have a familial connection with the Jewish people. I started my life off at Temple Emmanuel Synagogue in Sydney as a small boy.
Yeah.
There is something too culturally raw for me to enter some of those places.
I see.
Totally get it. Totally get it.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't be able to tell you if this would be a similar experience.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. You saw where I was going with this, because I was curious to see if other places that have dark history, if they would provoke the same response in you, because you seem from that you have this natural sensitivity,
yeah.
Whereas you were saying that the others went in and they were just fine, but you could not pass that threshold, which I think is a mark of the fact that you are empathic to some degree.
Look, as I've been in places we've travelled widely and obscurely, and I can say that there are varying ranges of spiritual experience in location, but that is the location which, and I suspect that also I had no knowledge of that cave before we were walked down to it.
Yeah.
And it's just that reminder that some sites, they're not. I mean, some sites there's a deep sadness and pain in them. This was beyond what a place of sadness and pain would have been. And that's when I would use language like negative sacred space. It is now anti-sacred. You couldn't put the sacred into that domain. Whereas if you look at places where Jews were incarcerated, like Auschwitz, they had their faith with them. And so in all the pain and all the sadness and the trauma and the loss, there is still prayer. There's still a cry to God. There's still a longing and connection with a God who cares.
Yes.
A God of love. And I think that prevents sometimes some of these places from going down a particular depth of dimension, because the relationship people had with God they weren't abandoned, and they didn't lose that while they were in those locations, even though they died. And their souls are not in those locations. The victims of the Holocaust, their souls aren't trapped at Auschwitz.
So it's kind of like a very dark place, but the prayers of the prisoners kept a permanent kind of light there to keep it from going completely dark. It's basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, God doesn't abandon his people.
That's right.
And they believed in their God. I mean, and ultimately, if they were to have been challenged in their faith, they are nothing but God's people. So the Jews who are in there, they were there because they were identified as God's people.
Mm-hmm.
That is the
It's a
last
kind of martyrdom,
bit of
isn't it? It's martyrdom in a way.
Exactly what it was.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how could we, with our religious beliefs and viewpoints about martyrdom and dying in the faith and your belief in God, say that they are anywhere but in the world to come?
I mean, reflecting on your experience in Burma, I had. I mean, obviously, one can't say I had a similar experience to you because I don't know exactly what your experience was. But you know what you've described. Where I was first a policeman, there's a place called Chalgrove in Oxfordshire, and one of the famous battles of the Civil War was fought there, the Battle of Chalgrove. And it's still largely the same as it was then. I mean, you know, there's an old high street. There is a bit of a few houses that have been added, but really it's still, you know, the fields that people died on. And I do think civil wars are particularly dark because they are brother against brother.
Right.
And there is a real darkness to that place. That is very difficult to describe, but you know, even you know, I was a 20-year-old policeman. I wasn't scared of much, you know, because I didn't have the wisdom to be scared.
I know what you mean.
You know exactly what I mean. And so, but I always felt uneasy there. There was an alarm at one of the where they developed ejector seats actually, so they stored explosives there. So we always had to attend, and it's right. You have to go all the way through the heart of where that battle was fought, and it always felt awful.
Yeah.
Like I say, no hauntings. It wasn't like anything touched me or spoke to me, but the place feels sad and
well, see, I think that's what gets left behind in a place like Auschwitz. I wouldn't think that, based upon what we just mentioned there, I'm full agreement. I wouldn't think that there would be any lost or souls there, because you're not necessarily talking about people that died poorly. They not in that spiritual sense, you know, because they had a tremendous faith, and they were dying in that faith. So that's very different than a person who unexpectedly is murdered, let's say, and perhaps is living most of their life spiritually apathetic. That's a different situation. So I wouldn't think that Auschwitz would be a haunted location. However, there is an energy that is created or manifested out of darkness itself that sort of resides in these spaces. And I think sometimes that that energy is what haunts a location, not necessarily the dead, but the remnants of the trauma.
By that extension, it'd be more likely that where the Nazis were put to death would be haunted.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's very likely to be the case. But I think sometimes we generalize haunting to being, just unrested souls. I think sometimes places are haunted by trauma itself. Trauma becomes a living, sentient entity, and it's an egregore. I mean, essentially, that's what it is.
Well, think of the loss those people were going through. Mothers and fathers being ripped from their children.
Well, that's the Dybbuk box.
Executed in front of them.
See, that's what I think the Dybbuk box is. I think it's a small microcosm of this phenomenon, and I think the inversion of that is what makes places sacred. So, sort of like the absence of this of holiness, the absence of peace, has its own inverse effect. And that sort of gives us, I guess, a vibratory balance that we could look for and say, this is what we're feeling when we go into a place like the cave, for example, that Father Firth talked about, or going to.
But you talked about this earlier, and I think this is something which we ought to all be guarded against, which is that, yes, there's those extreme examples of, the worst moments in human history. And of course that leaves an imprint, but, we create these things in our own homes if we're abusive, or if we, you don't need ourselves.
You don't need the Holocaust to have that kind of, to have terrible trauma that manifests in an environment that can eventually torture everyone that's in that home. And even people that move in later, even after the initial problem moves out, that energy stays, and then someone else comes in, and then it can impact them.
Awaken it,
Yeah.
Because part of the sadness of Auschwitz is also generations of people that have gone there and are sad there.
Yes.
And there's nothing evil about that.
No, it's just the energy.
Sad.
It's the energy.
And that's why I try to make the clear distinction between anti-sacred space and those locations, because they do not revolt the spiritual. They fill us with a sadness and a grief, which is not the same. And the other thing about it is, part of that feeling is that is the worst of human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads us to lament.
And the striving of a human being is to be something greater. So what are we? Where are we going? What is the point of our life? So sacred space, and that's why we should have and create sacred spaces in our homes and in our lives, because those questions dictate how we live, how we treat other people.
Yeah.
And so what happens when I die? Well, even if you said, there's nothing after this world, well, then the question will be, well, what's my legacy? What do I leave behind? What have I created in this world after me? And so we all dream of something big, something grand, and we want something positive after us, that our life had meaning. And those places tell us, actually, for some people, they never did. And that should make us shudder, because it means that if we don't try to create something sacred and grow beyond human nature, that behavior is only a thin shadow away. It's part of human nature. It is just to the side of us and can become the norm at any moment. And it's only when we are confronted by that reality that we can then compel ourselves to keep making change, to keep growing into something better. We are not like that. They are not us. And that pushes us to create bigger and deeper and ideally healthier identities that enable healing and a growth towards a future, and a future being and a future reality.
And I think that can encourage people to actually live the life of faith, is to say, because if it's all just about me and my own salvation, then I can go, oh, well, it's only about me, and I can choose yay or nay for that, But actually, if we communicate the fact that what we do has a lasting imprint and impact on other people, but also just on the stones, again, going back to the gospel, didn't Jesus say the very stones would cry out?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
If nobody spoke, the very stones would cry out. And I think that it's that sort of, I love that, because it especially for men, I can only speak with the knowledge of having been a man. I've not been a woman, and I never will be. But
I thought you
good to
sounded
know.
like a little girl father.
but for men, I think a lot of the time men need something outside of themselves to sacrifice for. That's the kind of noble aspect of masculinity, to sort of be bold and brave, and to offer ourselves for something noble and worthy. So we do need to have that reminder that, because I think Christianity's been so feminized in the West that it is all just about this kind of, self-development experience. And
that's my problem.
Don't get me wrong.
That's my problem with the I'm spiritual, not religious argument that people sometimes make. It's that, okay, that's fine.
It's very feminine.
It is, but it is a bit egocentric, isn't it? Because it's like the church isn't about being religious in an institutional sense. The church is about sharing sharing the intimacy of God with your brothers and sisters, so that you build each other up. It's not about just you. It's about the church is about everyone and our responsibility to each other. And I think that is largely lost in the modern era, where people make spirituality just about them and they make it a personal thing. There's obviously a personal component to it. You need that. That's also part of the intimacy of God too. I mean,
But
the
we need
desert
each
fathers,
other more.
but we need each other as well.
Right.
I mean, like,
But if you remember when I started, and we started talking about sacred space, and you'd rattled off all those ancient places that had been heavily embedded in this, and I said, it begins with the individual and turns into a family.
yeah, yeah.
What's happened is that we haven't given people language, and we don't create the sacred space. So the individual is still stuck at the bit where I'm spiritual, but okay, now where's the sacred space? Where are you now asking the questions which require you to talk? You have to speak them. Where are you speaking them? What are you doing with them? You're spiritual. That's very nice.
That's cute, man.
So with the Boswellia Sacra cuttings that I'm still praying heavily and swearing at, that they actually recover. That's very nice. But they don't become, they stay, and they only grow and become with the effort that's put into them.
Yeah.
It's like saying, good for you. What use is it for anyone else?
Yeah.
But it's a start. Oh, you've picked a football team, or you've picked a baseball team. That's very nice. Are you going to buy the tickets now? Are you going to buy the jersey? Yeah, that's everyone has it. No, do baseball people have jerseys?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
So everybody then has to do that, and then what? And we are not very good, because we are identified with an institution, at turning around and saying, okay, how are you going to explore this and have it have meaning elsewhere? Bring it into your family life. How are you engaging with other people? How are you building community? And all of that will then revolve around how you've made sacred space and what that is. And we hit that point where I can travel somewhere and I can buy something. So when we went through Cambodia, I picked up Buddha's sacred text.
Yeah.
I cannot read this. It's part of my collection of sacred texts from around my travels.
You keep it with the James Bond tarot?
No, I don't.
Different space. James Bond's got his own space, by God.
The James Bond stuff is just under a Dalek. On my shelf
where you
with my
keep the James
Anne Rice
Bond stuff.
novels.
There it is.
Oh,
Oh,
my
2 copies
goodness.
of it too.
Oh, boy.
Now, when I was in my undergraduate years, I was working in a library, and there's all these old books that they were going to chuck out because, libraries don't keep all the old books. One of those was this. This is one of the first Bibles that ever came to Australia.
Ooh.
Very nice.
Now, it was filthy. It was covered in dust. And they said, "Oh, it's not worth cleaning. Just chuck it out."
Wow.
Well, can I have it? Oh, yeah. You guys are working here. You can take the stuff with, go and throw it anyway. Now, in that moment, somebody else's apathy for what is sacred is lost. And it's only through conversation about why these things matter that we begin to embed sacredness into our everyday.
Yes.
Well, because it's the passing on of a relationship, right?
Yes.
Somebody has a relationship with a space, with an item, whatever it may be, that it's that relationship that makes it sacred. It's how we relate to it. And then that can only be shared through relationship too.
Right.
And you've got to have the language. And if you don't have the language, you have to create it. And who provides people with the vocabulary? That's our job. That's exactly what clergy are supposed to do. And if you're in a church or a religious group where people cannot leave the mindset of their denomination, it doesn't matter. If I believe I am right, that is irrelevant. If I can't leave the mindset of my denomination to engage with you where you're at, allow you to explore where you stand and what you believe and how that matters and links you to community, the world, and ultimately to God, then I'm probably not the right person to be engaging in those conversations, which is the beauty of Vestiges After Dark. It allows the exploration of matters. I'm quite sure Brian would hope that we all sign up and become disciples of his and members at the end. He can set up his own branch here in Australia with 2 clergy now.
I think he'd rather we were disciples of Jesus, but I know what you mean.
We know what he meant.
But it's about making
I don't think I could take the administrative headache, to be honest.
Father Yates is
we had some
very
great
good
dinners.
at admin, by the way. This is passionate.
I'm good with admin. Oh my goodness, I hate admin.
All right. Well, the next time you come out, I'll consecrate you a bishop. You can take over. How about that?
But there's actually that moment where the space, these programs allow people to ask questions. They don't have to like the answer, but they're also able to ask a different question. This becomes the beginning for some people of sacred space. And they can take that out with their exploration for where they are. Because even if it's just that chat room, these are people, I mean, the names are familiar. They're becoming
a community.
They become community. And in that becoming, they create something different, something new. And then we are something new. And we live something new. How many people who tune into this show and have clicked like, because that's always a good thing to do on the YouTube channel.
And subscribe.
I think I do 50% of that. I click the like. How many people then tell people about it? I engaged. It was my time with Vestiges After. It's my community, and it's that sharing that makes this space real. And it means that they've carried the sacred space of engaging here into their normal life, even if they only said one thing. They watched or they listened, and they live that sacred space, because it means that in the background, it's becoming part of the frame by which they perceive their daily life or their weekly life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's remarkable, honestly, what you just said, because there are, I think just looking at it from a YouTube show, which a lot of people, I think that that's all it is. And they see, we've got 940 something, subscribers. So not large by any stretch of the imagination. And each YouTube video typically has maybe about 30, maybe 40 live viewers, if even. I think it's 15 to 20 right now. The third hour is typically the people start dropping off sometimes. But you've got a small live base, and then maybe 250 to 300 replays people will have after that. So very small by the standards of these large YouTube channels that have like millions of people watching. But what is also remarkable is that the podcast has thousands that listen, not tens of thousands, although some shows have reached 50 or 60,000 listens, but most of them are in the thousands. And even in that small number, I regularly get out of the blue a couple, 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 or 5 times even a year, an email from someone that writes me or feels compelled to write me a little story about how Vestiges After Dark impacted their life in such a way that it changed who they were. And even though they're not part of our community on the Nicolean network, they never log into the chat room to talk. We don't even know who they are. They are just a person that's watching out there, and or listening actually, changes them. And that's why I do this show. So even though it looks kind of insignificant, everything that you just said there, that openness and that accessibility, and getting outside of the paradigm and not locking ourselves into our little Christian mold is important, because what happens is we've already established that egotism is not necessarily advantageous for the spiritual life. It's about sharing, it's about intimacy, it's about relationship. But what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that large church institutions become elitist operations, which is just another type of egotism. It's just egotism together, and they create one singular identity that excludes everybody else. And that's just as egotistical as just being like, oh, okay, I'm spiritual, not religious. I'm just going to, I don't have to go to church. I don't need the Eucharist. I could just be home. I don't need to go to confession. I'll just go to God. That kind of thinking is a type of selfishness. Honestly, that's the way I look at it. And elitism is a type of selfishness. Useful. No, it's not.
Look, I love arguing. I'm
no.
And since I'm nearly always right, it's helpful. No, but really, if what we do is we go about an engagement by a series of propositions, no matter how true those propositions may or may not be, that's not the way that you actually persuade, or that's not the way that you form relationship. You see, I could say, well, I have this particular doctrinal point of view. Well, then, rightly so, because I'm talking about a third area, we can debate that, right?
Right.
And that's useful from time to time, but not all the time, otherwise it's just kind of chewing on a bone. But actually, if I say, I've had this experience of life, like Father Walter did describing the cave experience, for example. I've had this experience of life. Now we're not debating a proposition that's a separate entity of its own. We're talking about something that we experience, that we find useful, that we struggle with, whatever it may be. We're actually talking about something which is experiential. And now it's not a third-party proposition that we can just, chew the fat over. It's a real experience that's being shared, and that's how relationships are formed. And that's really, what I see a great, even though I'm guilty often on this show of creating the sort of the doctrinal, non-personal environment. There is a use to that.
Well, I think, doctrine is important. Dogmatism, I'm not so sure is, but doctrine is important. And there is a difference between doctrine and dogmatism. I try to be doctrinal.
For example,
go ahead.
Rather than me saying, talking about the appearance of Our Lady at Fatima, which people can argue and disagree about, right? But if I say I had this experience of the Virgin Mary appearing to me and saying this, and I felt like that, then we're no longer arguing over whether it happened or not. We're just going to talk about, how I interpret that, how we, what message that might have for me or for other people. And that's what Vestiges allow us to happen. Because we actually speak with people and we're asking them not only about their oppositional points of view, but their experiences. And
I usually invite guests on that are very different from the traditional conventional Christian paradigm. I do that intentionally for that reason, because I know most of my audience is from the paradigm. So I like to get them to be exposed to the other side of the coin. I don't want to miss the last question. I see that there's one more over here. I
think it was answered, but we'll run it through. It was from Not Sure.
Okay.
And I hope I can read my own writing. Is it more important to put up a sacred space, more so if you live next to a graveyard?
Okay.
It referenced like sigils and oils. How often should this be done, and how often should you recharge?
Well, Father Firth did answer about the graveyards. Graveyards are sacred spaces.
But Not Sure followed up with a later question in the chat, which I got, which is related, which we might be able to get onto, which is, instead of investigating a haunted location, would it be best to spend that time praying for the souls?
Every single time. I know that
I think four of us answered him in the chat like, yes.
I know paranormal investigation is cool. Okay. It's the in thing right now. The TV shows have made it a big deal. And certainly it's fascinating, particularly when using technology and you're getting, answers back and they're relevant and it leads one to wonder, and it kind of satisfies that curiosity about what happens after death, because even a person of faith, doesn't have the answers to that other than the fact that we understand the general direction. We don't necessarily understand how that actually is experienced, how it feels. These are largely beyond us. So there's a lot of curiosity about the afterlife, and maybe even a little bit of doubt in some people. Even people of faith might have maybe in the back of their mind a little bit of doubt. What if it's all just a lie? What if it's all just, maybe the scientists are right and we all just die and become nothing? So I think everybody struggles a little bit with this from time to time, and dark nights of the soul and everything else that can happen. So, getting validation in a tangible way with paranormal investigation sort of is exciting, because it kind of opens up some of that world that is we're so divorced from, we're so separate from, it's so distant from. And so I get it. But the problem with it is that if it's not doing any actual good, if it's just to satisfy curiosity, well, then you're kind of turning the dead into sort of like a circus sideshow. And I do have a problem with that. I do. I'm the first one. It's like, look, I never watch any paranormal TV, but the one show that I always watch was Ghost Adventures, and I find it funny that I ended up on that one. I don't watch any other shows. People always ask me, "Did you see this one? Did you see?" I don't even know who they're talking about half the time, because I am so disillusioned with the paranormal community, particularly those who are on TV, that I just kind of stay away from it altogether as much as I can. I work with my colleagues. That's it. And so if it's not related to Ghost Adventures, I don't really know a whole lot about it. I know the names of the bigger people, but I don't really know what they do or how they relate or anything else. That's by design, because my goal, and even being on Ghost Adventures, my goal is just about helping people. And sometimes those people are living and sometimes those people are dead. But if I'm not going into a case with the intention to resolve whatever is wrong there, and anytime there is paranormal activity that is disturbing people enough that they would call an exorcist or call a paranormal group to come in. That means that there's something spiritually wrong there that needs to be resolved. That is not an opportunity to satisfy our curiosity. That is an opportunity to help someone who needs help, because typically if things are going that bad, they're looking for help. There's a wonderful, and I really encourage everybody to watch this. There's a wonderful, if you got Netflix, Unsolved Mysteries has returned to Netflix, and they're in the third season now, and it's very different than the original show from the 80s and 90s. They're 1 hour episodes. They're no longer these 5 or 6 different stories in one episode, and they're very well done in documentary style. Great production. I mean, really a work of art the way they do them. And there's this one episode about a haunted apartment, and then they go through what the woman there experienced. I'd love to get her on this show. We should probably try and talk about it.
This.
You do. And it talks about this murder that happened decades before. And the activity she was experiencing in this apartment was truly beyond anything that I've ever encountered. I mean, she's talking about like, she walked in and all of the dolls of her child were all piled up in the middle of the room.
Nope, I'm out.
And then we're talking like 20 or 30 dolls and stuffed animals, and they would put them back, and then they'd go out, and then they'd come back, and they'd be back in the pile again. And then they'd walk in, and then the cord to the lamp would be doing like jump rope. And it would just be spinning in midair like that. It was fascinating stuff. And then it takes you back to a murder that happened, and the woman who was murdered was in that house. And so fascinating. Yeah. As a paranormal investigator, you'd be like, I'd love to see this. I'd like to experience that. And then somebody that's probably on the more devious side would say, let's try to capitalize on this some way. Let's pay people to go and stay in the apartment.
Charging
charge people
$180 a night.
But I'm saying that for activity to get to that degree, to that extreme, it has to be at a level that there is so much trauma, and it is a message to us, help me. Right. And if you're just going there for entertainment value, you're completely missing the point. So I have a problem with it, and I would say that, yes, every single time, don't investigate, pray. That's all you have to do. You don't even need to investigate. You don't really even need to do more than that. Just pray for the dead, and you will have done so much good. There's a wonderful thing that said, I forget which saint said it, but it goes something to the effect of, we don't know the impact that we're having on the dead when we pray for them, but when we die, we will be welcomed by countless people that will come to us and say, it was your prayers that helped me.
Yes, I heard that was a quote from a priest, I believe.
Was it a priest? I thought it was a saint.
Wasn't it?
Was it a saint?
Oh. Yeah, it's a saint.
I think it was a saint.
I just saw this on Facebook.
It's not going to come.
Days ago.
I know exactly who it is.
Right.
Bosco.
There we go.
Beautiful.
Good job, Bosco.
That's our opportunity. Anyway, we're at the end of the show. Thank you, Father Firth. It's been fantastic. Let's do this again.
Great show. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
No problem.
And Father Chris, thank you. Jamie Wolf, thank you. And we'll be back next week with open lines, open topics, okay? You can call into the show, and we'll talk about whatever you want. You tell us. And it's the season finale. I wanted to do 10 episodes. We're just going to have to settle for 9. It's, like I said, been a cursed season. Not a sacred season. Next season, hopefully we'll make it sacred, okay? Hopefully better internet. Anyway, until then, next week, I'll see you out there in the ether.
Take care, everybody.